Another type of lyric poem is the ode. And an ode is a relatively long poem, serious and dignified in tone, subject, and style, often with an elaborate stanza structure. Odes are usually written to commemorate or celebrate an event, object, or individual. The mood of an ode is meditative. Pickering and Hopper tell us that odes are particularly likely to be idiosyncratic, with each stanza differing from the others in the same poem, both in rhyme scheme and in length of line. This poetic form was used by ancient Greeks and was a particular favorite form of the English Romantic poets. Consider the following excerpt from Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. In this excerpt, the speaker celebrates the deeds of the West Wind. Notice the elevated and formal language used. So notice the formal tone of the poem for something that is commonplace, right? Like the wind, right? So Shelley writes, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow. So notice here how he's talking about the wind blowing leaves around and blowing seeds, but notice the elevated language, right? So the ode is very ceremonial. Her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. Another type of lyric poem is the elegy. The term elegy has come to describe a formal meditation on death or other grave and serious theme. A poem of mourning. Harman and Holman state the meditation often is occasioned by the death of a particular person, but the poem may be a generalized observation or the expression of a solemn mood. So usually an elegy is written because a certain person has died, but the poem itself tends to be a meditation that's very general. It's a generalized observation or expression of a solemn mood. So it's not just about the death of this certain person. It's about how people die, and death is something that we have to deal with as human beings, right? So consider this excerpt from the poem Lycidas by John Milton. Milton here is commemorating his friend Edward King, who drowned by referencing ancient Greek heroic characters, including a shepherd, a centaur, and a man wrongly executed, all known by the name Lycidas. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more, for Lycidas your sorrow is not dead. Sunk though he be beneath that watery floor, so sinks the day star in the ocean bed. And yet anon repairs his drooping head, and tricks his beams, and with new spangled ore flames in the forehead of the morning sky. So Lycidas sunk low, but mounted high through the dear might of him that walked the waves, where other groves and other streams along with nectar pure his oozy locks he laves, and hears the unexpressive nuptial song in the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. There entertain him all the saints above, in solemn troops and sweet societies that sing and singing in their glory move, and wipe the tears forever from his eyes. Now, Lycidas, the shepherds weep no more. Henceforth thou art the genius of the shore, in thy large recompense, and shalt be good to all that wander in that perilous flood. So Edward King has drowned, right? But Milton uses this occasion as a way to explore the fact that all who have drowned and who have died have new life, right? Thanks to um, he that walks the waves, right? Jesus, right? Jesus Christ. So, you may have sunk below the water. We may sink, excuse me, below the water, but we all can live again and be raised even higher through Jesus Christ. So this is mourning the death of Milton's friend, but it's also a contemplation on death and what happens after death. Now, we've talked about free verse before, but recall that free verse or verse libre deliberately attempts to free itself from the restrictions of the fixed conventions of rhyme, meter, and stanzas. So we've been talking about uh, poems that have a certain structure, that a definite structure. And there are many other poems types than what we've talked about. We've only talked about a few of the most common. But there are also poems that seek to break free from structure, and we call that free verse. Because free verse seeks freedom from limitations of these traditional techniques, and not to abandon rhythm and rhyme completely in many cases, those who study poetry have recently preferred the term open form poetry to free verse. So free verse is not devoid of rhythm and meter, it's just devoid of the limitations of these structures like the sonnet or the ode. You know, free verse is more free. It can, there can be different rhythm and different meters, and you can rhyme in some places and not in others. So it's not totally free of these things. It just doesn't have a structure, and that's why some people like to say open form poetry. As Roberts and Jacobs point out, we originally called this type of poetry free to signify its liberation from regular metrics and its embrace of spoken rhythms. But open form poetry is not therefore disorganized or chaotic. So often it does have a form, but it is not so structured and so limited by structure as the forms we have studied. Open form poets have instead sought new ways to arrange words and lines, new ways to express thoughts and feeling, and new ways to order poetic experience. Many poets reject free verse, excuse me. For example, Robert Frost compared it to playing tennis with the net down. However, other poets have used it effectively. Furthermore, while poems written in free verse often still make use of conventional poetic techniques, such as alliteration, assonance, repetition, and even rhyme sparingly, they also might have lines consisting of a single word to emphasize it, might separate words and letters on the page unconventionally to signify meaning, might use long lines so the poem closely mimics prose, or might use punctuation in an innovative way. The poem Fog by Carl Sandburg makes use of free verse. So, fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So notice that does not have a regular rhythm, right? It's more free. And as you read it, even though the lines are not long, it does sort of sound more like prose, right? More like it's just a sentence. But the way that it's arranged on the page is poetic. And finally, Sometimes the way a poem appears on the page indicates meaning. A concrete poem is one where the arrangement and look of words and lines is just as important as their sound and meaning. Roberts and Jacobs suggest concrete poetry represents a fusion of writing with painting or graphic design, and the emphasis is on the visual. Concrete poetry has seen a flourishing in our modern times, um, but it's very, very old. I mean, people have been arranging poems in interesting ways, you know, since poetry has been around, right? Um, so concrete poetry may use different font types and sizes, may make use of symbols, may arrange lines to form pictures, or space words or letters on the page unconventionally. One of the most famous concrete poems is Easter Wings by George Herbert. So notice how the lines are arranged as wings, right? Um, so this is how the poem was presented, but in order to read it, you have to turn the poem sideways so you can read the lines.